This is Jainism and Sikhism. Let me turn this on Do Not Disturb so I'm not bothered by things. If the hikers come, it'll be okay because we're here. Today we are finishing off our Eurasian continental religions. So in other words, this is the last edition. We did the major five and we've done some smaller ones. These both, Jainism and Sikhism, find connections to the Indian subcontinent and that region of the world. So they'll finish us off. They're both somewhat dharmic religions, although we'll find that Sikhism actually is a little bit more of a hybrid, a little bit as we saw last week, in terms of, what was the other one? Confucianism and, yeah, Taoism, in terms of Taoism.
Can you spell these two words?
Yeah, Jainism is Jainism. And then do you want me to wait for and actually I'm even pronouncing it wrong because I've done it my whole life. I've always thought it was Sikhs. Did you hear it? It's not, it's Sikh. And the plural is Sikhi, which the junior high boy in me thinks is hilarious. Yeah, it's Sikh, as in like someone is sick, but Sikhi, Sikhi. Anyway, but we're going to start with Jainism, which actually sort of has and again, I might need to back up at certain points because these two, again, like last week, being more Buddhist based or far Eastern based religions, these finding their origin in the Indian the continent and area of India and Pakistan. Sorry for the noise out there. They do overlap, but like last week, how one believed in reincarnation and the other believed in sort of a creator God, Jainism we'll find believes more like Buddhists, and it's an older, and it does find its roots also in Hinduism, but it wouldn't associate itself with it. But Sikhism, or Sikh, if I say Sikhism, just pardon me. It's just one of the. I've been trying to say it today, but then every time I start saying Sikhi, I start laughing again. It's just. But they and Sikhism comes out in really full force in the last century. I mean, the last millennia. So one dates back super old. One dates back to the last millennia. Now the same thing is, and again, similar to last week, and really that's just tangential because it doesn't really make a difference how they compare. In the sense of what I want to point out is that last week we had one of them believed in a creator God, the other believed in a sort of ethos of just sort of eternal truth and heaven is truth and everything. Same way here, and what the hell tells us is if you go from, I guess from your angle, from the West, where you get those Abrahamic religions being birthed in Europe, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, obviously in the Mediterranean, and all the way into Persia, as you bleed over to the East, you still have some of those monotheistic tendencies. You still have some of those creator God narratives, and then eventually you get over far east into the coastal East. You really have more emphasis on that Buddhism, that sort of setup. And so I guess all that is to say is there is clearly a cultural merge in the middle, because you both get monotheistic, and in these being representative, you both get monotheism, and you both get, and also you get a dharma or cyclical or reincarnation based belief system. So the first one we're going to look at them independently, and then I'll try to do my best to separate them in my head and compare them. But Jainism is also like Hinduism is considered one of the oldest religions in the world, and in a more concrete way actually dates its origins back to about 2500 BC. Today, they are about 3.5 million worldwide, which is not very big in terms of a globally recognized religion, but in India, it's a much larger percent. It's and if you when I and this whole Jainism finds its major root in India. So if you think of India being sort of coming down to that point, and Pakistan being sort of up here, it's in that northern, I guess, northeastern side of India, northwestern side of modern day Pakistan that you have the locus of this group. It is considered an ancient Indian trans-theistic religion or philosophy. And trans-theistic in the sense of there is still a theism there. In other words, and when we talk about theism in Christianity, we're talking about the personification of a personal God. There's a being that we relate to. That's in Islam, that's in Judaism, that's even in Hinduism, that creator God. And the trans-theism is theistic is the sense that that there is a God, but it has always been. It's not there. It transcends the material world and is an existence, is sort of in the sense of the unmoved mover. There is no beginning, there's no end. And so they worship the sense of a deity, or they will use gods as sort of pathways to this eternal truth, but not in the, again, the personalized, I'm praying to this ultimate creator God, which is true for Hinduism. True for Zoroastrianism. It's true for, that sense of monotheism is not there at all. And it's not atheistic, in other words. It's not the denial of anything or the existence of anything. It is a different category for their understanding of the divine. The divine is truth itself. So in the same way, Buddhism had that sense of you materialize into the world, into the cosmos, when you've reached the ultimate enlightenment, you become part of that eternal truth. That same mystical cosmology is there, and we'll talk more about that as it unfolds. A few just interesting things that I just sort of noted to the side that didn't really fit anywhere. They're considered lacto-vegetarians, meaning that they don't eat anything that would cause harm. You're going to see through this whole stream of thought of Jainism is that nonviolence is probably the biggest thing about the philosophy or their religion. And so to the point that they don't eat root vegetables, because when you pull a root vegetable out of the ground, you disrupt the root system and you may cause harm to the insects that are there, to the extent of, and I don't know if, again, I mean, within every religion, there are people who are super strict and people who are pretty sloppy. But to the extent that there is a notable, or at least it's written somewhere, that during their periods of fasting, they often don't brush their teeth. Because the fear is there's like this extreme denial, and by fasting and not brushing their teeth, they're not harming the microorganisms that are being cultivated in their mouths. I'm not laughing at them, I'm laughing with them. They didn't have a youth minister saying you should always have a mint with you, and maybe they did. Maybe they don't have a problem. Maybe they just use Altoids and water.
Do they use Altoids?
I don't know. I didn't search for that information. They are among the top. They are among the top 70% in terms of income in their cultural context. And that includes Muslims and Hindus being where they're at. So, but they are that 70%, in other words, 70% of those who identify or claim to be Janist, or a Jan, are in the top 70%. 70% of them 70% of them are in the top tier of income earning, and they are among the most educated. So it's a very, in other words, you got to put yourself in the context of India. When you see, that means that when they see Jans, they associate them with a higher tier of religious order.
What attracts you to that religion?
To be honest with you, probably a lot of it's just geographically cultural. I think that there is so much variation of some of these I mean, like these are starting to blend in my head. Like, how do you keep them apart? Now, you might say the same thing about Christianity and Judaism. How do you keep it apart? Well, it's easy for us because we're natives in that land or in that religion. But when I look at these things, I'm thinking like they're all starting to blend together. And again, that's not surprising because there's an overlap. But I think culture is probably one of the biggest things in these. As we saw last, I think it was in Taoism last week, that the filial, wasn't it there? No, it was in Confucianism, the filial piety, honoring your parents. We talked about the Asian cultures. There's a big emphasis of not bringing dishonor to your parents. I think that as a underlying virtue of all of Asia and in part of India, I would say that that's there as well, that we don't have as much in our Western concept, but it's heavily there, a part of your honor and sense of identity. That would keep those within their faith more, because you don't want to fragment that relationship. It's the same reason when we do Mormonism and we have the woman who comes to share who's a Jack Mormon. She's not really a Jack Mormon because she hasn't really rejected it. And she hasn't rejected it because she doesn't want the break in ties with her family. And that doesn't happen as much here in this. So if you're born a Janus, my guess would be, and that's just I would say an informed guess. I wouldn't say lightly educated guess. Yeah.
What's the connection with being a vegan?
Non-violence is that you wouldn't eat any meat.
To the socioeconomics.
I mean, probably in the sense of, I don't know if there's no real connection in the socioeconomic basis other than the fact that they could probably have more choices and it becomes a virtue because they probably could afford meat. They are lacto, meaning that they do have cheeses and curds and dairy. But that is viewed as because of the relationship they have. They view animals with a great level of respect. And so even as they take animal products, they're doing it because I'm guessing to tease out the argument that they're extending great care for the animals that they receive these benefits from. But they're lacto-vegetarians by and large. Okay, just some general stuff. They believe in the eternal dharma, meaning that there's an endless cycle. Dharma is that cycle of seeking or attaining enlightenment. So in this regard, their ultimate goal is liberation from that cycle. And it's not liberation from the cycle, then you go here, because that's a linear, more Western mindset of heaven, hell, we're in the middle, you go to one or the other, and then this one's going to be really good and this one's going to be really bad. They see it as a cycle, never ending. There is no, hey, let's get the cycle started. It just always is what is. In the same way we say that before there was a material world, that God is, he was the unmoved mover. They would say this is what existence is. And that, I guess that they would probably say that those who create God are, in a Marxist sort of way, or, the opium of the masses. It helps to identify an origin of something rather than accept the world in a cyclical nature. But the goal of that, or the goal of the human in that regard, is liberation from that cycle. So every time, if you can get in a reincarnated way, you can get better and better and better and better, to the point that when you reach this eternal bliss, this level of attainment, like again, the turtle in Kung Fu Panda, instead of dying and being buried, his body actually literally goes through a, metamorphic process and becomes non-material. And in that movie, it flutters away. I should show you this. Kung Fu Panda, this is like a total reference and no one's ever seen. You should all watch Kung Fu Panda. Maybe we should do that after all of this. Yeah, we should have a movie series this fall on. Actually, honestly, that would be really fascinating because after learning about these things, because if you watch The Matrix, like with Neo and Keanu Reeves, it's so filled with both Christian and and Buddhist concepts. The idea of just, endless cycle of but the also existence in the material world and non-material world. And They have a strong understanding, like I said before, of nonviolence, and that permeates everything. And honestly, for the amount of everything boils down to nonviolence to everything. Plants. I mean, there's a sense of just conscientious awareness of one's existence in the space of this world and how one interacts with everything. And when you put that even beyond the human to human relationship, and you put that into the human animal and then into the human plant and to the human material world, although they see the material world as sort of an entrapment in time, there is a deep respect for that, because in the concept of nonviolence, if you can exist in this world in that way, you continue to rise within that, in that reincarnation cycle, obviously ultimately getting to a place of absorption. Yeah.
Is there any Christian religion that believes in reincarnation?
I mean, no, I mean, we have a little bit of a, these are words that we use to describe phenomenon. We say, we kind of view it as you die and go to another place, but in some sense, and this is interesting when you think of reincarnation. Incarnate, the incarnation is the idea of the embodiment of the carnal nature, the human. So when we talk about reincarnation, they're talking about the reiterating of the body in material form. We talk about a new heaven and new earth, but we don't assign any sort of materiality to it. And that could be because of lack of understanding or revelation, but we acknowledge that we'll have some existence in a new heaven and a new earth. And we imagine that new heaven and new earth in a material way, despite the fact that we might express our existence in it as non-material. But this goes back to what I often have ruminated about, was that prior to the fall, we didn't have the same metaphysical makeup that we have now. We were more like Christ, a resurrected body. I like to think of Adam and Eve flying. Just, we all have our weird particularities, but I'm just saying, Christ could fly around, so he's a prototype for our afterlife. So, no, but I do think there was something when God introduced death into this world for our narrative, for our cosmology, that means that death didn't exist in our structure and our framework, that we were not beings that would die, because death was the consequence of the fall. And the absence of death is not death. So, you all haven't heard that as much. Not you have, but I can see you noodling like, this is the first time I've heard. They've all heard this before, so they don't. And I do define that as my own ruminations, just to be clear. In this system, they believe there are 24 Tirthankars, which are supreme teachers of Dharma. And that endless truth, that endless cycle, they're supreme teachers of how one gets to there. They believe the first was Rishi Bhagavadeva, I don't know how to say it, and that this was the first supreme teacher was millions of years ago. So obviously they believe, and I typed in the question, do Janis believe in evolution? Because that would then place the existence of some sort of humanoid millions of years ago, and it's really kind of boils down to evolution as a non-category for them, because they don't see it as they would have seen the life cycle of humanity as extending much larger and much longer. In other words, humans have been around for a long time, and there's an endless cycle. So in those cycles, you can have different phases in a societal or ecosystem of rises and falls. I mean, there's them who think that Incans and all of the technology around the Incan and Mayan civilizations represent a technology that was far greater than its time, and point to, for some, other eras or ages on this world that are a part of the history of time. But millions of years ago, and then they believe there are 24 of these supreme teachers, and that the 23rd was around in the 9th century BC. And keep in mind, that's around the time of King Solomon. And the 24th, the last one, the Mahavira was around the 600th time. And this was, again, just to put it in the time frame when Israel would have, I mean, depending on where this dates, where Israel was in exile and returning to establish itself in Jerusalem after Persia recovered or took over Babylon. It's all 600 BC is also makes this Mahavira, the 24th teacher, around the time or a contemporary of Gautama Buddha. So what I'm pointing to is that around this 600 BC mark, there was stuff happening in Buddhism, there's stuff happening in Jainism, there's stuff happening in Judaism, there's stuff happening globally around shifts in the way major religions are thinking or are receiving revelation. And I think and as I have studied this, I'm seeing those points of intersection. Not that they all line up perfectly, but it means that there's stuff happening even now, as we of church are starting to figure out what it means to be the church in this 21st century and in the next 500-year period, essentially. The same time, other religions very well might be doing the same thing. And so the last one came, like I said, around 600 BC, and this is the one that wrote their sacred scriptures, they're called the Agams or the Agan Sutras, and they're basically the truths of Jainism, and they're written by this last teacher. And then this last teacher is, where did I put that? Or is that? One of these. Oh no, that was the next one. See, I knew I would do that. These are yours, Jim. Okay, whatever. That's for you. Thank you. He has some homework he has to do. He was naughty, so I gave him some extra.
Do these religions interact at all? I mean,
yeah, I think, this is why you see the syncretism, you see the lining, and in all of these, we talk about them when we reflect back on them and we think, oh, the Janist, people identified, I'm a Janist. It was far more fluid, and it always has been more fluid. And I think in all of these, it probably was bound more culturally than it was and even in this, it probably has fluid it is now. Christians marry Jews, there's just sort of I just did a wedding last year between a Hindu and a Christian. Although I struggled with that. I also didn't want to not represent the Christian and then have her be without. So I felt like and honestly, I think it was ultimately, I'm glad I did that. But there is that sense of a fluidity that I think has always existed, but in times we tighten up those things that we believe, like in political systems right now, everyone's tribalizing, and whereas within world religions, you see a fluidity. We see this sense of and this fluidity and rigidity happens throughout the history and culture of all sorts of things. It's this constant pendulum swing of it gets too fluid and they have to make it tighten up, it gets too rigid. And there's always leftovers from that. I was listening to a podcast that talked about English, how the English as a culture are very modest and almost prudish. And that's a remnant from Puritanism. And as they maintain their cultural collective, their understanding of what it means to be English, that became part of their identity. And so to deviate from that, you then separate yourself from the culture you're in. And we as Americans don't have that. You Texans probably are the closest thing to be like, I'm a Texan, that defines me. Everything else is secondary. For the rest, what's that? Well, for the rest of us, I'm like from Ohio. I don't even like telling people that. So, but there's just a fluidity, in our culture as a whole. And I think that exists in these religions as well, in the sense of belief. And so you have religions influencing one another over time, over hundreds of years. But your adherence to those were probably based more on your family systems than anything else, and then your communal systems beyond that. which is how things were passed down for most of civilization until the last probably, 3 centuries. Okay, today Janist monks are those who, and they believe in asceticism is a huge part of how they understand themselves. The 3 pillars, if you will, are nonviolence, and that is probably the most central to them. Non-absolutism, and that is, in other words, humility. To claim something as absolute is to claim authority that does not belong to you. And I think that we as Christians often fall into this as well. Faith is faith because it contains doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. Does that make sense? And so in the same way, but that's not often how Christianity is expressed. This is the absolute truth. I know it. Well, then that's placing my understanding of truth over and against your understanding of truth. And then you become the unenlightened, the person that I have to then bring to a place of enlightenment. And this is the concept behind modern day evangelism. And then if you just make a good decision, then you're in the club too. Whereas faith seeking understanding, or faith without proof, that's where faith comes into play. I don't have any, I don't know what's going to happen when we die, with any sense of certainty, other than my own convictions and experience and the revelation that I have with God. And I'm willing to be a part of those community of seekers who have sought that out. But at the end of the day, just because someone says this is true, you can be like, pish bosh, I don't care what you say, and move on. So non-absolutism in asceticism, and that brings us into the idea that monks are not just, that it is a higher order in Jainism because it is a commitment. And at one time in European culture, monks were revered as well. We don't revere them in the same way in Western culture, and in large part because they represent the exact opposite of how most Westerners live their lives.
So if they're a monk, is that they're calling they're a monk? It's not like Buddhism where you go into monkhood for a year and then.
No, this is a way of life, and it's kind of another level. And again, and I would say that monasticism is another level of, it's a denial of other things, and I think I personally think it's not a balance. I think it's out of balance. Although I do think monasticism, in general, represents what probably life will be more like in an afterlife than what we have now. Having your day defined, there have been times in my life, and I think to myself, to have your life defined and characterized by prayer 3 times a day, or 5 times a day, as if it's a Muslim or so. That is when I go visit the Tizay community, and 3 times a day, I stop what I'm doing, I reorient towards God, I realign with God's spirit and what's going on, and not just in a 5-minute break, but in the morning it's about 35-40 minutes, in the afternoon it's like 30 minutes, in the evening it's like an hour and a half. But 3 times a day I'm in this space. And do I leave there with a better sense of myself and the groundedness and my call and my vocation? Absolutely. Why? Because if you spend a week in that sort of life, now imagine doing that every single day. They said this is why reconciliation, this is why forgiveness, this is why love, these things that God calls us to, are able to be realized in that community, because they spend a good chunk of their day in prayer. And if you're going to sit next to your brother and pray, you have to be in relationship with that brother. And so they can't let things fester or wait. That doesn't mean those things don't still creep into them, but it's like learning a language. The more immersive you are, the faster you'll learn it. But the monks monkhood is characterized in that asceticism by nonviolence, a pursuit of truth, and a no theft policy, which I keep thinking that's funny every time I see that. I'm like, and I think maybe it's like, it's always like, when would it be ever right to take something that's not yours? But no theft, chastity, and non-possessiveness. And again, that's a non-materialness, but that's in that reincarnation cycle, there's the devaluation of the material world over and against the eternal world that they believe we live in. It was said by someone that it's looked at as a self-help religion in large part because, and Buddhist, I guess, is the language you could call Buddhism in the sense of that as well, in the sense of there is no higher power helping you. Everyone is responsible for themselves. Everyone is on an individual pursuit, but it's done in this communal sort of pursuit. So although you're not alone, you ultimately are accountable for yourself. And I think that taps a little bit into Christianity. There's something called the three jewels, which is right belief, right knowledge or thought, and then right conduct or action. And I don't remember, I didn't look back. We saw this somewhere else in the past. I don't remember, but that sounds pretty familiar. When I was reading that, I was like, oh yeah, that was before. I didn't look back to see where it was, but that sense of it's again, as I'm reading through this, I'm thinking to myself, these are people who are striving to make the world a better place, to not be selfish, to not allow the materialism of the world to define them, to be nonviolent, to serve their community. I mean, like, there's just so much that is admirable just from a humanistic perspective, let alone a religious one. They believe the Atman. Did you raise your hand? No, okay. I just saw something in my peripheral vision. The Atman, or the soul, the essence of us that's in us, is eternal. That our souls are eternal, but the function of matter, I thought this was an interesting way to phrase it, the function of matter, the matter in the sense of the world that we live in, is to contribute pleasure, suffering, and frame our life through the cycle of birth and death. So in other words, matter, the material world we live in, has a function, and it's meant to make us, one, enter into the cycle, but two, pain, meaning to avoid, you're something you're avoiding, or pleasure you're going to seek, to find the balance between that in that endless cycle that goes around. So the sense of the soul is not attached to it. There's a detachment of the soul to the body. In that regard, there's a little bit of dualism there, or that sense of the existence of the soul within the body, and the body is just a temporary vessel for that season. But the true essence of this, the world, or the existence, the universe, everything that's there, is non-material. They believe the path to enlightenment is nonviolence, and that the ultimate goal for us is to reduce harm to plants and animals, and others in general. But even beyond that. That when we are nonviolent, when we show this care, when we live in this intentional space, and we move throughout this in that way, that we actually, that is the ultimate virtue realized. So again, I think someone was watching 7 Years in Tibet. Didn't someone watch 7 Years? Someone told me they were watching 7 Years in Tibet off of my recommendation. I don't remember who it was. Pitts, that's who it was. So if you see the Pitts, ask him how it was. But in that movie, Brad Pitt again is, he's trying to construct a theater for the Dalai Lama, and it's going to take forever because they're pulling every single individual worm out. So they're sifting through, to lay a foundation. They have to make sure that there's no harm caused. Such a different worldview from how we live our lives here, which will be interesting as we turn next week to peyoteism, to the native, to the religion of the First Nations of this land we live on, that they have a very naturalistic connection to nature, but with a greater deal of respect. And actually, if you've ever seen the movie Avatar, the blue creatures in Avatar, that has all sorts of, that'll be another movie we can go back and watch, and the spirituality that you see in Avatar is in part derived from peyoteism, but you'll see that there's also influences from the West as well. Let's do some, let's do some categories just to, as we have in the past, to clarify. Like Buddhism, there is no God. The goal is to be assimilated into the existence of the energy. In other words, we are separate from the energy, and we're trying to pull the energy. We're trying to have this enlightenment. We're trying to have this, this sense of the mystical side. We're trying to attain that. We're trying to reach out. It's a longing for it, and then you become almost part of it. We recently watched Star Wars, and that's kind of what happened to Yoda. He just sort of, materialized into the existence and became part of the Force. And so then he could conjure up, basically, at the end of the movie of the Return of the Jedi, you have Yoda and you have Obi-Wan, and then they redid it. They digitally remastered it and they put the new Anakin Skywalker in it, and I was not happy with that. But that same idea that they can rematerialize because they exist in the realm of the Force or the energy or the light or whatever you want to call it. They view humanity as an endless cycle of material existence that holds our Atman, our souls, and again, there is no divine judge that's saying you did a good job or bad job. It's just the sort of natural flow of energy determining. If you're constantly putting out good energy into the world, then you're going to be reincarnated in a better place. And if you're not, then and how that actually works out into to me, I think as a Western, I think I did something bad, that's a mark against me. I did something good, that's a mark for me. Well, I don't exactly know how that affects it, but the goal is a liberation from this cycle of reincarnation to achieve what they call a state of moksha, which means a state of all-knowing. What's that?
No, I'm sorry.
You said it sounds pretty good?
No, I said, sounds like Klingon.
Okay, I didn't know what you said. I just thought I'd say something that sounded like you might not want it to say. But yeah, moksha is the state of an all-knowing state, or a state of just full knowledge. So, which I think is interesting, is I can't help make connections to it, almost the temptation that we read in the creation account of the serpent saying to Eve, you can be all-knowing too. You can be above all of this and see all of this. So that's their goal. And some might say that maybe we will end up in that state. I don't know. My understanding of cosmology is there's still differentiation between the created order, even in a new heaven and a new earth, and the creator, whereas they don't have a differentiation. In the ultimate blissful death, as you are absorbed into this, into the existence of truth and pure light. Therefore, creation is uncreated. There's no beginning or no end. They believe all substances are constantly and continuously in change. And so this is how they account for the constant evolution of the world. We look at these mountains and they're like, how beautiful, and they just seem eternal. Well, at some point, this land was flat. And plates in the world, this is a constant change and shift. And so they're looking, and again, if you think your religion goes back, millions of years ago, and that there were humans through this, then you start to see, we view back 6,000-ish years, but open your minds and think not 6,000 years, but millions of years in the existence of humanity. And so, and this is honestly in doing the timeline game for the Bible, and understanding that actually in church historians or biblical scholars, as they look and they date things, they, even in a young earth view, they may place Adam and Eve at 4,000. But what was fascinating to me, again, is that Cain and Abel was placed at 3. And in my narrative, I always thought Adam and Eve, the Cain and Abel were the first kids. But again, that sense of our time, we're squishing things together. We don't really have, we connect narratives together without any sense of space or time, although we continue to exist in a time, and really outside of the past few centuries, we don't really process how time works on a typical everyday basis. I talked about scriptures. They're the words written by the 24th supreme teacher. After life and death, the soul is life and death. After the soul is separated from the body and reincarnated. Oh, and then I did write down the sin. These are the bad things. So if you want to be honest, these are the things you're going to have to avoid. Violence, falsehood, stealing, sexual activity, possessiveness, anger, ego, deceit, greed, attachment, hatred, quarrelsomeness, false accusations, telling of other people's secrets, backbiting or backstabbing, delighting in evil, and a resistance to spiritual acts. Which again, there's nothing, I mean, like, that's pretty good stuff. I mean, yeah, you should avoid, I don't see anything in that the Bible doesn't quite kind of point to as well.
Sounds like the Ten Commandments.
I mean, not far. It's a little bit, a couple of those were, I thought, I mean, and it, yeah, I mean, it is in some sense, especially, the possessiveness that came up several times. And again, that's that sense of sacrifice for the other. But when you think just about how pervasive the sense of property, how many do not trespass signs do you drive around in this region of the world? Don't get on my land. In fact, I remember Judah was playing a game first summer we got here, they were playing a game, some game through town, and one of the friends ran through one of these yards, cutting through as they were chasing each other, and some guy pulled a gun on him, get off my property. And yeah, and that's why we were like, oh, don't run through anyone's yard. But that sense of possessiveness, and don't get me started on it. Have you ever seen Eddie Izzard's thing on flags? You put a flag in it and it makes it yours. That's what we did. We went to the moon. We're like, it's mine. I put my flag in it. I got here first. I mean, it's like the most juvenile way of solving disputes or deciding, and we'll see this when we look at peyoteism next week. Peyote, native tribalism, the first tribes, nations, and I say first tribes, we'll talk about more next week's, but that their understanding of belonging and property is far more, it all belongs at the earth, as opposed to, I'm going to put my flag in it and that belongs to me now. So, all right, any questions about Jainism? That's kind of the general gist. Yeah. 3.5 mil. Yeah. Which actually is not a lot comparatively to, I didn't know Sikhism is actually the 5th largest religion in the world with 25 to 30 million.
So what accounts for their prosperity, this group? Why are they in the top income and top education?
I think they would probably be in those categories. Originally, I don't know. Maybe that sense of maybe they live out their faith in a more real way. With a smaller adherence, maybe they have, the smaller the group, the more cohesiveness you find, the less division and sense of splitting, and over time, what does that mean? The Presbyterians are among the most educated of all of the denominations in the country. We're also the wealthiest. Other than the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church has more money than any mainline or non-mainline denomination. We have a higher level of education. Why? Because, at some point, the hallmark of Presbyterianism became scholarship. One of our flagship seminary, Princeton Seminary, is one of the top theological institutions in the world and has more PhDs teaching globally than any other denomination. So that means that, again, that greater influence is a greater, I think just cyclical over time, people hold on to things. So that's not to say that those who are Methodist or Lutherans are not intellectuals as well. Although there is a joke about Methodists being more devotionalist. Any Methodists in the room? No? Yeah, Methodists. Starting this week, we're doing a Being Reformed class. Come on over. And I grew up in the Assemblies of God, which does not have a hallmark of anything intellectual. What's that?
In your experience.
No, I mean, I was pretty deep into it, so, you know. No, I mean, you know what is there, and I shouldn't say that because, I mean, I had my intellectual awakening in the Assemblies of God schools. So, I mean, I think there is intellectualism there, but it's deprioritized. Whereas I think in mainline in general, mainline denominations, you have a prioritization, even Roman Catholic, any mainline denomination prioritizes rationality and faith-seeking understanding. So. All right. Seek any other last questions on, I mean, again, I'm no Giannis expert by any stretch of the imagination. This is just scratching the surface.
I'm kind of curious, you said there's 24 figures that.
Yeah, teachers, yeah.
Why did it stop?
You know, I asked that question myself and I just sort of loosely in my head, I never really pursued it. Why, I mean, you know, why did Islam stop at Muhammad?
Yes.
Why does this one we're going to look at now stopped at 11? There were 10, I don't know what 10 gurus in Sikhism. And the 11th, actually interesting, jumping ahead, the last one, the 10th, said that there wouldn't be another one and made the scriptures the 11th. So now the scripture is considered a guru itself, which I thought, I'm like, you know, that's sort of bending terms for me. I'm like, I don't know. But I mean, in some sense, we kind of did the same thing. We made the scriptures the new Protestant Pope. So, you know, this is why we believe in inerrancy, or we have this whole doctrine of inerrancy that is pervasive in the church, because we needed an authority. And we'll look at that actually this coming week, and on Sunday, we'll look at the Reformation and what happened to the word. And in a little preview in that, we said, oh, they, you know, as we had people pushing against the authority of the church, they doubled down on the authority of the Pope. And when you're having your mindset that papal authority goes back to St. Peter, you're rejecting the authority of the Pope. Then they say, well, the Pope's infallible. This is God's designated sort of man on the earth to guide things. And they're saying, no, sola scripture, one of the mantras of the Reformation, scripture alone, becomes this saying that who has the authority? No one has the authority. The scripture has the authority. And then as literacy and intelligence and IQs, but I think the capacity to learn and grow began to expand. The more you have people digging around it, the more you blend cultures, the more it expands, the more different views you're going to have, and then you have 2,000 denominations later. So, yeah.
They have temples and communal worship.
Are we going back to Jan? Yeah, yes. There is, and I didn't go too deep into it. Looked very Hindu in their expression. Rituals play a part of it, but actually a lot of it is also personal. That sense of self. I mean, the level of self-awareness in the world in Jainism stood out to me. In particular, because you're constantly in this space of like, what am I causing violence to? Am I stepping on a bug? Am I, you know? Whereas I think you can still have respect for those things, but not have it be a consuming presence. Whereas if you're constantly in a cycle and you're understanding, you've been taught this is the way you reincarnate to a better life, and ultimately to what the goal of life is, liberation, then you're constantly in a space of operating with that mindset of how do I not get caught in violence unintentionally?
Couple of questions. Do they have politics?
I did not go into the politics, but yes, I'm sure they do. And because they live in an area that has both also a prevalence of Hindus and Muslims, I'm sure that it's actually challenging.
And when you think about total nonviolence and taking care of the worms, you're doing right. How do they think they can be that thoughtful and kind and insightful of what each person is?
Well, it kind of goes back to that if everyone lived by the golden rule, we would have a radically different society. If everyone personally said, I'm going to love others as I actually would care for myself, if we all operated then with every interaction we had all the time in a very intentional way, I think that would foster a vastly different world. So then when you put that in a cultural context where this is sort of a cultural expectation, what you do is you begin to foster a better way of living. And ultimately, I think you rise in those virtues because the cultural context you grow in. I mean, it's kind of, why are Mormons such good people? Why are they such moral people? Why do they care for their neighbors? Why do they, in general, people, other than their kooky beliefs, which we'll cover in a few weeks, they're really good people. Like, I would love some good Mormons if the apocalypse ever hit. I know they all got food for me. No, I'm just kidding. But my point is they've created a cultural context where that's expected. And so I think that breeds itself. So, Al?
Back to the thought of nonviolence for everything. What did they use in the early times for fuel to build a fire? I ask that because if they cut down a tree, damages the tree and kills the insects and birds and nest away.
My guess would be fallen wood, and maybe fallen wood. How that then you'd have organisms living in that wood. I didn't get that deep into it, but yeah, you're right.
Do they put self-preservation over the nonviolence? So, for example, like if you're not brushing your teeth are going to fall out eventually, and you're going to have a harder time. All of those things. How do they balance that, or do you have any concept?
But here's the thing: is
self-preservation versus the nonviolence?
The notion of self-preservation is a possessiveness to this world, and would be considered a vice. Even what you just said would be like, oh, you're trying to preserve yourself, Al. You're worried about those teeth. They're pretty, but they're going to fall out eventually. I know when I die, I think I don't know how many. Most of my teeth are crowns right now, so when I die, it'll be. That's why I have them gold. So if things really go bad, I can pop those babies out and melt them. Okay, let's go on to Sikhism. It is, or Sikhism. I'll keep doing that. It's the 5th largest in the world, which I thought was interesting, with 25 to 30 million. It is a dharmic Indian philosophy or religion, as we've seen in the others, largely in the Punjab region, which if you think of, again, Pakistan kind of being kind of like this here and India coming down here, it's in that upper area that bleeds over into India. The Punjab region, again, spans both national lines or the division between the countries, but that doesn't mean that culturally that there isn't, actually having Manav live with us this last summer, it's interesting to see how all the different cultures in that religion have overlap. For his birthday, I wanted to make him a biryani. It's a Indian rice or Indian dish, and I was like, which biryani? I started looking, and they were like, a lot of them. Every country has their own, but they all have rice and they all have basic stuff in it. But the blending again of those cultures means that you're going to have the influence. And this religion is actually influenced directly more by Hinduism as opposed to Jainism, which I think is more, although earlier, which I thought was interesting because I always viewed Buddhism as sort of coming out of Hinduism, but I actually now, in reading about this, that Jainism had an effect on Buddhism as well, and could have probably been the blending of Buddhism and Hinduism, or the Jainism and Hinduism blending into almost an expression that maybe came into Buddhism. And again, I haven't studied that much to know. The statement that a quote was, "Truth is the highest virtue, but still higher is truthful living." And the idea that how you live your life out matters. Again, that sense of consciousness, a sense of awareness of how one exists in the world. This is a religion that is both monotheistic in the sense that they do have a doctrine of a creator God, but it is also in the sense of Buddhism or Eastern religions, panentheistic. It's not pantheistic, that God is everything, but panentheistic, that God is in everything. God's essence and presence is everywhere. So one God, but with a pervasive presence. And in that regard, not a personal God in the way we've done with Christianity, but still a figure or a deity that has a character of his own, although they would say that God is genderless or is not male nor female. Sikhs are the folks who, if you haven't ever seen, or maybe you've seen a movie or seen cultural things, they're often associated with wearing turbans. And both men and women believe in covering their head. They grow, they don't cut their hair, and we'll get into that in a little bit more why, but the general essence is that it demonstrates the perfection of God's creation. That in our hair, it sort of just continues to grow. So it's forbidden to cut any hair on your body. So, there's no shaving of armpits or legs. It's just, this is what God created you as. This is the hair God gave you. You shouldn't cut it. Yeah.
And why did they cover it up?
Why do they cover it up? What did I write down here? Note taking. Where did I read that? I don't remember. When it comes to it, maybe it'll, I don't know, maybe the protection of the hair. I don't remember actually now that you're saying that. I remember I wrote down no taking off of turban. I know that they're not supposed to take it off, and having their hair, and this is a problem too for Sikhs if they do actually end up obviously in a system of of prison in the U.S. because they would have their hair cut. So they don't cut their hair; it just continues to grow and grow and grow until it falls out. And actually, now that I'm thinking, I wonder how they view baldness. But anyway,
So do they?
yeah, I guess you're right. It would be natural.
When they sleep?
Yes, it's not in public. You're not to have it in public. It's to cover your hair.
Was it a modesty thing?
I think it's probably a protective thing in some regard. But again, I didn't dig down into that practice too much, although now I'm thinking I should have.
In the military too, do they now allow them to?
Oh, they allow that,
Yes,
yeah.
as part of the uniform.
Yeah.
Because it's their religion.
And the beard they can't grow. And I don't think that starts, and then there's some reason in my head, I didn't read this, but I think in the back of my head now that we're talking about it, is I don't think that has to start until you're at a certain age. So that's why you see young boys without the turban on their head. And so when you start to wear a turban, when you start growing your hair, that's sort of the sign of adulthood, which I do think happens much earlier than like our 18. So the history sort of that brought them into the present is they only go back to 1469 to the Guru, or the 1400s. Guru Nanak was considered the first guru, and he lived from 1469 to 1539. That's not to say that there wasn't some sort of base of this religion or people within the people group. It sort of, this is where things shifted or changed. But Nanak was a boy who was fascinated, who came from nobility and fascinated with spirituality, and he went with a friend of his who was Muslim actually, and they would go and listen to spiritual conversations in the day, and then when they went to bathe, they would bathe in the river like everyone did there. But one day he went to bathe in the river and he didn't come back, and then 3 days later he returned, which I think it's a little interesting. He came back and said, there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim, and was sort of claiming this sense of, and then I think this is where the differentiation of Sikhism is to Muslims and Hindus in that region. They call him the illuminated soul. So he was an illuminated soul. He wasn't a prophet. He was not a holy man that received a divine revelation in the same way. But was, I guess he did receive a divine revelation, but not in the sense of having any sort of powers. But he's considered a guru. And then there are 10 gurus, and I didn't write them all down. So again, Guru Nanak was the first, and then
Was this BC?
no, this is in the last century. Yeah. I mean, the last last millennia. The 10th was 1666 to 1708, and it was Gobind Singh. Oh, that was another thing, just as a side thought, or a side point. The men who are Sikhs all have Singhs, S-I-N-G-H, attached to their name, and all the women have K-A-U-R attached to their name. So, and there's a sense of, and there's an interesting, I read something about the equity of that they all, there's a greater sense of equity in Sikhism than there is in some of the other Hindu-based religions. Not that there isn't still patriarchy affecting it, but there is a greater sense of equality of humanity, and that'll play itself out here in a few minutes. And the 10th is the Gobind Singh, the last guru, is the one who named the religion Sikh. And he also named the scriptures as the 11th, and it was called Guru Granth Sahib, and it was basically a declaration that there would be no more gurus.
Who wrote the scriptures?
It comes from the writings that came previously and also from him.
You said there would be no more gurus?
No more human gurus. And the last guru is, so in other words, he maybe they were like, what are you gonna do? We're at the 10th guru, we can't keep going like this. They're like, let's figure out a way to stop it. I don't know, but I mean, there's a sense of, and for the last, obviously, 400 years, there hasn't been one to emerge. So it has a religious group has accepted that restriction. So they have three golden rules, if you will. Remember God constantly. That's a constant, and again, that sense of total awareness. This is there's a monastic phrase that the idea of living a God-centered or God's present life, and you're kind of always, Brother Lawrence wrote a book, Practicing the Presence of God, and it was about finding God and doing the dishes and in daily tasks. And that sense of just awareness of God all the time in everything you do. And I mean, I think that's a great way of living one's life. Pray without ceasing. It is, yeah. I mean, honestly, that's why I like the Taizé chants. I like when I'm in the Taizé community, and when you spend the time in prayer and you're saying those things, I mean, I don't know how many of you probably have experienced this, even after maybe your prayer service where we sing, Jesus, remember me, and then later in the day, that's sort of lingering in the back of your head.
All of them.
Yeah. That's praying without ceasing. Even subconsciously, your soul is in this space of. The first golden rule is remembering God constantly, earning an honest living, and having nothing that you do in your life to cause harm in terms of your living, and then sharing your wages with others. Now, remember, this is not a reincarnation or a cyclical based cosmology. So this is about you have this life to live. Although I think it does actually dip a little bit into it, but we'll come to that in a second. The 5 Ks they call them, and because of all of the words, I believe it was in Sanskrit that they were in. All start with Ks, but I don't have them written down that way. But the uncut hair is, oh wait, actually before I do that, where is it? Because it actually matches up a little bit.
Is there 4 instead of 3?
3, remember God constantly, earn an honest living, and share your wages with others.
Oh, then nothing cause harm, is it?
That is, I mean, that's just general. I mean, no harm to others. The nonviolence was the part of, that was Jainism. Not that they don't also have that. The 5 thieves, and then I'll go back to the 5 Ks because they relate to them to some extent. But there are 5 thieves or 5, and they have other sins. They call it Maya. And what Maya is defined as sin is a temporary illusion that provides deceptive or illusionary satisfaction and pain. And so sin is that which tempts us away from this sense of selflessness towards self-preservation. And they name 5 that drive. Ego, anger, greed, attachment, and lust, and they view that the ego is the main reason for evil. that sin or maya is a separation from God, from this creator God, and that they believe that we are in an age of darkness. So we're living in a material world that's an age of darkness, and we're characterized by these temporary illusions that we're drawn toward because they relieve us of pain. But we jump back up and we look at the 5Ks. The uncut hair, like I said, that's a surrender of the ego. I am who I am. And man, you want to put that, we could tease that out and do an interesting conversation about the cosmetic and, appearance practices of our culture in this day and age, all the way down to, I have to say it sometimes that I think that you see these Hollywood types who have had so much work done that they look like, yeah, it's almost like a freak show and yet that their attachment to their self and their ego and their perception of how they are is what's driving everything about them. And they would say that is, evil personified. A wooden comb, or usually wooden comb, I guess it doesn't have to be a wooden comb, but traditionally it's a wooden comb. So, sorry, these are the 5 things that they have, their uncut hair, they should have with them at all time in order to be considered a Sikhi. A wooden comb, and that's to maintain that mane of hair that they're growing. So it's not like you can just leave a bedhead all the time. You have to care for it as well. A bracelet of metal. Usually it's usually iron or I don't remember the other. It's not usually like something. It was actually pretty. I think if iron or steel. I want to say. I don't remember. I didn't write it down, but it wasn't like gold or silver. It wasn't flashy. It was, but some sort. Maybe, I think copper maybe it counted. But it was some sort of bracelet of metal, and that is a representation of a shedding of the falsehood of and a. What did I put there? Shedding a falsehood, and a pursuit, a love of universal truths. And so it's a reminder of their pursuit of truth and to rid themselves of falsehood. Short garments. I couldn't help think of the Mormon special underwear, but I don't think it's that. It really is a representation, and it said short undergarments. So I think it's just maybe like boxers or something. They wear something underneath, but it's considered part of the ritual because it's to remind them of sexual fidelity. So it's like an extra layer that you don't mess around with, So it's maybe if you're tempted, you take off your outer layer and you're like, darn it, this special underwear. Yeah, I know. I don't know. Again, I'm just scratching the surface, folks. I'm not digging too deep into this stuff. So some of you have to take with a grain of salt. And a small curved knife, and some of them carry a little tiny one. But it's supposed to be like the double-edged sword, and it's double-edged sword of knowledge. And so the reminder of their pursuit of knowledge, the sword is meant to represent knowledge. So what you have here is hair representing the perfection of God's creation. You have the care of that perfection, I guess, through a wooden comb. You have a bracelet reminding you of falsehood and the pursuit of truth. And all of these sort of attach, not perfectly, attachment, ego, anger, greed, and lust were the 5 thieves, and they're meant to somewhat counterbalance those in some way. I wrote down main concepts because everywhere, and I wrote down a bunch of words because everywhere I just kept growing because I read somewhere else would say it's this, someone else would say this, and they all kind of dip into the same. But again, I mean, there's variations in everything, and with 30 million of them, and I'm sure they don't believe in exactly this. They don't emphasize the same things in the same way, we don't either. But equality was a very common one. Social justice, service to humanity, those were all sort of central to almost every description. That sense of there is a balance of life. There is, and I think even, and as we look at, and as I talk in a minute about the view of God, there is that sense of, even between sexes, a greater sense of equality, I think, than I saw in some of the other ones. A tolerance for other religions. And I think that's a very strong Hindu influence, that sense of openness to the other. I mean, again, Hinduism being one of the most tolerant or open religions, or considered one, this as well, probably in that same vein, but it comes from the same roots. A deep reverence for God. And this is a creator God. This isn't like a dharma, sort of transtheistic or any other conception of God. This is the creator God. Pure reverence for it and an appropriation of who we are in relationship to the God. And then beyond that, just social characteristics of honesty, compassion, humility, generosity. I mean, this is sort of like we've seen in a lot of these. It's a sense of caring for neighbor, caring for the world, caring for everything around you. Their core beliefs compared to ours, I've mentioned some of them, but I'll go through them nonetheless, but their view of God, again, I just wrote down various things that I read that all sort of contribute to this, but one, a wondrous God. There's a sense of distance, of wonder about who God is, and but also believing that God is shapeless, timeless, something that we also believe. Creator God, that all things came through the creation of God, God's hands, or personified hands. That God is truly incomprehensible and invisible. We would assert those same things. Although we have revelation to who God is, we don't, in our capacity, have the ability to understand who God is beyond the revelation. And God is genderless, although understood as father and mother. Similar, I would say, in the same way that Christianity does, that God is that we personify God as a king or a lord, that's sort of in that masculine or figure of a man, but then the creator, the nurturer side is feminine. We use the masculine pronoun for God, but in the vast majority of Christian theology, I mean, even in evangelical circles, we would argue that God is neither male nor female, and that the angelic celestial world are neither male or female, and that we are given the designation of male and female for the propagation of the species, in the same way other mammals in this world were given those parts in order to propagate the species. So in that regard, we become the convergence of the created order that has been given the system for reproduction, but also with this sense of soul about us that exists. The formless one was another, and that is sort of, how did I put that there? The formless one, I put it in quotes. I don't know why, I don't remember why. They view humanity in that regard as the soul, our collective souls, as the bride who waits for their husband, the Lord. Which I was like, wow, that's kind of similar to Christianity in a lot of ways. They see the purpose of human life, or the purpose of humanity, is to reconnect with the Akal, which is what their word is for God. We say in our catechisms and our confessions, the chief end of man is to glorify God. And so there is that same sense of it's about our relationship to God. They believe that this God called Akal created all things, and that God created multiple worlds. Which I think is interesting, because I think we all toy around in that, where I was like, yeah, God created other worlds. We don't really have a way to conceptualize that, but, and I think, why not? Who's to say God can't create other worlds? Like, for me, again, the denial of God's ability to create other worlds and have this, whatever's happening in this world in another fashion, another solar system, another, I don't know that I would never confess that as a truth, because how am I supposed to know that? But I would also never deny that God has the capacity to operate in that, because that would be me projecting a limit on God that would be problematic for other parts of theology. The scriptures are the Guru Granth Sahib, which again is the 11th guru, and here it was composed by the previous 6 gurus, so it included the last one and the previous 6. So at some point they're like, we're going back to this guy, but not before him. And so they took the writings from that, and the same, I mean, we do similar things. We go back, if you want to look at us, we go back to the prophet Moses. We take his writings, we take writings from King David, we take writing from the prophets, we take writing from David's son Solomon. We take writing from, Samuel and a few of the others, but in general, we're going back and we're looking at the holy individuals in our existence, and then in the 400 years of silence, you have the Great Assembly of the Jewish tradition that we're assembling and writing. But we look back at those and then us as Christians, we say, oh, well, there's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and they're written by the apostles, and there's Paul, and then we go back to those original figures, and we're like, well, that's where we're going to stop it. So we all have measures of judging that rely on our connection to these figures that we believe represent some sort of transcendent revelation from the divine. They don't believe, although they do believe in a creator God, and this is where you have a little bit of that blending, they don't believe in a heaven or a hell. They believe in absorption. That in that your individuality is lost. So it's almost like we're all in the last stage of reincarnation, and we're going to be absorbed, I guess. But there is an end. There is a place where that stops. And in that regard, they differ from Christianity or from monotheistic religions, but it's not as if you're going to a place called heaven. You're being almost like the end is more that dharmic side of being absorbed into, rather than having existence or individuality. In other words, we come into this world with a greater sense of individuality than we will exist in the afterlife, which I can buy into. So, the earth is temporary. A view of creation is that it's temporary. There was a beginning, and they don't have an understanding necessarily of the destruction or recreation of the world because of the fact that you're absorbed into whatever is beyond. So I think that's about all I have, and so we have 9 minutes for questions. The too much is two is a lot to process, because again, they start to blend a little bit, but.
Do any of these religions, did they prohibit intermarriage with other religions?
I did read about that, but I didn't write it down. I want to say that I kind of feel like, if I remember, Jainism was a little bit more, you marry within, and Sikhism, I think that you can't be married in a Sikh temple, but you could be married outside. But and honestly, and I didn't go down that far into, so.
It's interesting to see how, as our societies and as travel, has blossomed and people.
Globalization, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. How you see these entering into our everyday life, just veganism and yoga and
Absolutely, meditation
and all those things.
Chinese symbols that people get their bodies tattooed with that probably say things like pig rather than truth, but but no, it is. This is the effect. It's the shrinking.
More than 100 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. And just a reminder for all of us, when we started this and we looked at sort of the category or the beginning, we looked at world religions from that 50,000 foot perspective, that world religions is a product of the last century. Hinduism is a categorization that Hindus prior, 500 years ago wouldn't be like, I'm a Hindu, because that is a name that we're placing on them to encompass a system of belief or a philosophy, a common philosophy. It's not, and maybe modern day Hindus that we call Hindus would call themselves Hindus because they're a product of their culture and generation of this is the way the world views them. It's kind of like we think Christians were always called Christians, and not that the words weren't used, because you're always going to label someone for who they follow, but the commonplace name of Christian is something that eventually that had to surface too. I think we self-named ourselves more of that than the way we named Hindus. But all of world religions were beginning to be classified in a time where we started to see the shrinking of the world because of transatlantic travel, and then the invention of the airplane, and We began to be revealed, have other cultures and spaces and belief systems exposed to that. And this is honestly, just to bring this home, this is one of the challenges that we have in Christianity right now. And in fact, during my time as the National Director of Campus Collegiate Ministries for the Presbyterian Church, Christians were the worst catechized participants in interfaith dialogue. And Hindus typically knew what they believed, and Buddhists knew what they believed, and Muslims knew what they believed, and Christians were like, I can be anything. Because part of that is because of the blending of things, and the globalization and the adaptation and the lack of catechesis and a cohesive identity. Muslims, Mormons know what they believe. But what's interesting is, and that was taking the pulse in about 2014. In the last couple of years, I've had conversations with people who are still in that field, and they say that they're starting to see Hindus and Muslims and Jews have a much looser understanding of their faith, just like the Christians. Is that a good thing? It's a bad thing? I think I don't know. I mean, you can,
Do you think it's maybe a little bit, we've talked in the past about the separation of children from adults during the service and all that kind of stuff, and they lose that anchor from the parents.
I think absolutely.
Religion might be experiencing.
I don't think Muslims do that. I think Muslims are like, this is what I think this is why Mormons have the most successful rate of transferring faith amongst American Western religions.
Oh, okay.
I mentioned that to someone after the thing last week. After this last week, I said, the National Study of Youth, it was somewhere, I don't remember what I was talking about. National Study of Youth and Religion looked at all the Christian denominations or traditions within the U.S. Catholics did the worst at passing down faith. And then it was like mainline Protestants, American light mainline Baptists, sort of things like that. Our General Baptist Convention, sort of, they have some liturgy, but it's still. And then you get down to evangelicals, then you get down to racial ethnic groups, then you get down to Pentecostals, and then Mormons. And so the success at passing down faith to your children, Mormons scored the highest, probably because they are all working within the system that is cohesive. And the evangelicals too. I mean,
They're also the youngest.
it is, but I do think it goes, it's kind of like, why does faith transfer better in a racial ethnic context? Because you have a collective community, and the identity of that community is tied to the passing down of those religious ideologies that one has, as opposed to, we live in a day and age where secularism has taken root, and we can kind of choose whatever we want to be, and we can reinvent ourselves in a drop of a hat, and that's the world we live in. And that's why we're facing the challenges that we're facing in our culture.
Has anyone tried correlating the passing down of faith and religions to the divorce rate in the different religions?
No, I'm positive that within Western Protestantism that has an effect. And in fact, that National Study of Youth and Religion, which again began in about 2000 and is present today, every 5 years they're revisiting the same 3,000 people and saying what's going on in your life. And they're basically analyzing the millennial generation and how they've conceptualized faith over the years. But what they've found is that now, I guess, what are we, 23 years after the beginning of the study, and they were studying teenagers then, so these are young people in their early 40s. Those who have a continued faith, there's a number of things they credit, but one of the things that they credited was the father's faith, the way the father, and even though with the acknowledgement that most of the faith rearing was done by the mothers, it was still the perception of the father's faith that had a profound effect on. So those who have lasted faith after 20 some years had strong father figures with faith in it. So
Is Falun Gong, Falun Gong, the religion, is it considered a religion? The Chinese people that are being persecuted, and so many of them are coming to the United States.
I don't have any idea what that word even. I don't know how to answer that, because I don't. That isn't even.
Okay.
Is that something new that's going on?
Well, I don't know.
Because I get all my news from Facebook.
I don't know how new it is. It's a
Yeah.
religion that.
What is it?
Genocide. Falun.
Falun.
Gong.
Oh,
Yeah, and they are being
All right, I'll look in,
persecuted and murdered in
let me look into it.
China.
Yeah, I mean, there's always weird,
But I think you kind of look at, I forget what it's called, but in the Amish community when they are.
Rumspringa.
high school or something.
Yeah.
yeah,
What?
Rumspringa.
Yeah, and their return rate is like in the 90s.
Yeah.
You
Because
know?
it's ostrich, as and if you ever seen, I don't remember what the movie was called, The Devil's Own or something like that, it had the word devil in it, but that is a fascinating and heartbreaking movie about Amish kids breaking free from those, what I would say, and having lived in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, literally watching a horse and buggy go by my front door every day, a culture of inconsistency and abuse.
Oh, it is.
Oh, and that's just speaking of the region I was in, but
So why you get 90-some% coming back?
because the relation is in that close context of a culture relationship, that's why people don't leave cults.
It's like witness protection. We literally walked away from everything you knew. Every family, every friend, if you left it.
So, all right,
And I think it
Yeah.
goes back to that sense of community and belonging.
yeah,
You separate from that and you're lost.
Yeah.
And you go back and, the Northern faith, very similar in that you live in a certain place, this is your temple where you go,
Yeah.
and this is your automatic community.
And also,
You're
yeah.
just out there floating around.
And this is why I'm a big proponent of intergenerational formation and keeping kids. I would speak strongly against ever taking children out of the main corporate body of the church. We don't need Sunday school, we don't need children's church. Those children need to learn the rituals of the church, and when we stopped having in the church is when we broke down those rituals, and now they have nothing to hold on to, which is why we're seeing, again, the largest hemorrhaging of young adults from the church ever in the history of civilization. And we know how to fix it, but the problem is we're so fragmented as a culture, we don't have any cohesive practices, which is why I'm very big into practices. You go back to the idea of what are the identifying practices that form and shape us, if we can put emphasis on those, which is why we'll never in this church, as under my tenure, ever have anything other than one service. That's the reason I want one service, because then you have different flavors. Why would I be opposed to having a contemporary worship service? Someone was like, Grace, more people from Grace may show up if you have a contemporary worship. I'm not that I'm have anything against contemporary worship, but the rituals of a community are what tie that community together. Silas understands himself as a Christian and a Presbyterian because it is all he knows. And someday, as Judah is, in exploring what it means to be a Christian in a secular context, he has been anchored in an identity that then he has to say, this is who I am. How do I understand these things? Not in an amorphous environment of having lacking an anchored identity, but of saying, this is what my parents taught me I am. I can buttress or adjudicate these views off of how I am. But if this is smushy, or in the sense of I'll let my kids grow up however they want and choose when they're older, that is a unfortunate collateral damage from evangelicalism that have left.
I agree with what you're saying. But at the same time, the contemporary worship services bring large numbers of young people back into our churches, so I'm kind of conflicted with that.
Well, and I would say that's because we've pulled them out into a Mickey Mouse here and given them contemporary worship, so they're seeking the very thing that we raised in the spiritual patterns they were raised in. The difference is modern day worship is ephemeral.
Is it what?
Ephemeral, non-lasting. The things that, we don't look back at no one's singing Shine Jesus Shine in their worship services. And if you go to a service that was, you'd be like, these people are stuck in the 90s. Whereas the reason we draw from as we have been in church, a hymnal that dates back to songs that go back to the 4th century. The reason that 4th century song lasted is because it contains sound and orthodox theology, regardless of the music, and every song that is there represents the way it has shaped a time and people of a particular generation or century, and they are the things that have lasted. Trust me, there were a lot more hymns that were written than we have in the hymn book, but only those that had some sense of cohesiveness or some sense of longevity to it lasted because of the way they functioned within the community. They were the living liturgy of the body. And we're in a place now where, and that's why, not to say that I'm opposed to some special music highlighting some modern day worship song, that's actually a more appropriate place for it. But I think that when we sing hymns, it's not just about singing because it's nice to sing. We are engaging in a practice that has spanned thousands of years and that characterize the history of our church and tell the story of our church and express the theology that has been accepted by the church for centuries. It's not our own whims and our own experience with God that we're personifying in a song and allowing to lead others. It's the collective history of our church that characterizes how we express our faith. And that's how traditions are passed down. So, all right, I'll get off my soapbox and end for today.